All right, welcome ladies and gentlemen to lesson 13 on industrialization. This is our last lesson of the first semester, so I hope that you are diligently getting caught up if you need to and getting all your work in. This is going to be a little bit of an easier lesson for many of you because the vast majority of the questions, in fact all the questions, are going to be multiple choice. There's also an extra credit associated with this lesson as well, so please take advantage of those if you need a little help. So without further ado, we're going to talk a little bit about the topic of industrialization. Industrialization, as the name would suggest, deals with the idea of changing from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, an economy built on making things, usually in some sort of a factory type setting. And this was really the way that the U.S. came to be in terms of an economy after the Civil War. And you can see the dates, 1865, the end of the Civil War, up until the 1900s or so. Was really the change being made. With that, there was a lot of changes related to where people lived, how people worked, and the way that cities operated. So we'll talk about all of those in this lesson. As I said before, there was a real shift in terms of where people lived. So before the Civil War, let's take a look and see what Americans were doing. And it turns out that only about 12% of Americans worked in industrial jobs. The vast majority of those were in the northern part of countries, in factories. The rest of the people were agrarians, or for the most part they worked in the fields. They were in agriculture, they were farmers. By 1900, however, the United States was the world's most industrialized nation. So between that time, those about 40 years in there was a huge shift driven by the Civil War and the need to build arms and armaments in terms of the way that America worked. There's also a huge movement of people from the farms to the cities. The jobs were in the cities. That's where the factories were, so people had to move from the rural areas to the urban areas. And we also had a large influx or incoming number of immigrants, especially from Europe on the East Coast and Asia on the West Coast. Where did most of this happen? Well, industrialization took place across the country, but the vast majority of it took place in the Midwest. And it took place there for a number of reasons. One is that's where the resources were. This map, it's hard to see, but you'll take a look at it a little bit more in the extra credit opportunity. This map really shows where the resources were. So where were things that people needed to use to build factories? So coal and iron ore and things of that sort were located for the most part in the Midwest. The other part about the Midwest is they had very good transportation routes. So you could move things that were built in cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh to the East Coast and also to the West Coast based on the rail lines and the Great Lakes. Some of the things that spurred the change over to an industrial economy were some new inventions. We have a number of famous American inventors, notably Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone. Before that point, if you wanted to converse with somebody, it had to be a letter that was transported in person or by the telegraph, which had to be sent and received by someone who could understand it and then kind of translate it. The telephone allowed for people to talk directly, real time, at the speed of light between each other. Thomas Edison, of course, is a famous American inventor that probably most of you have heard of. He invented the light bulb, which for the most part is used today in the same form that he made it, a standard light bulb, and also the phonograph or the record player, the precursor to CDs, and really the first opportunity to record something down onto a media and then play it back wherever you want it to be. And then we also had Cyrus Field. Cyrus Field was important. He's a name probably most of you haven't heard of, but he was really important because he helped lay what's called the transatlantic cable. And that was a cable that went all the way across the Atlantic from London to New York. So now not only could we talk with each other internally inside the United States, but we could also converse directly with Europe rather than having to go across the oceans, which saved about 3 months in travel time. Another thing that was hugely important in terms of the way industrial nation worked and also the way people moved was the railroads. Railroads were being built, as we saw in the last lesson. The Transcontinental Railroad was built in 1869, so soon thereafter the Civil War. And with railroads came settlement. When the government wanted to kind of give an incentive for companies to build railroads, they gave them land. And so the railroads were able to sell off this land that was adjacent to the railroads to people and to corporations. And so there was a huge movement of people, especially moving west along the rail lines, where they could settle and buy very cheap land. Because there was so much land, because there was so much money to be made in railroads, there were also a lot of scandals. And you'll read about two of them. One's called the Robber Barons, and then one's called the Credit Mobilier. And both of those had to do with lots of money and lots of land and scandals associated with them. So if you think about some of the scandals that we're dealing with today in terms of our economy and the issues about banks and things of that sort, this was something very similar. It just happened to happen in the 1800s. Big business, a lot of money to be made in industrialization. The economy was changing. No longer was it one person making something or somebody farming things. Now we had giant corporations, and the economic base was not used to this, so there was an opportunity to make huge amounts of money. Corporations were built on something called the economies of scale, and that is the idea that if you make lots of something, you can sell them very cheap. So if you think about it, let's give an example of a car. A car is a very, very expensive thing to make one of, but if you make many, many thousands of them, the price goes down because you can buy lots of materials, you can build lots at the same time, you can be more efficient. And that same thing was happening with corporations around the country. We also had vertical integration, which means that all the way from the mining of something to the producing of an end product happened within one corporation. So if you happen to be a company that made railroad cars, you probably also were a company that made steel. And there were also monopolies because of this. And some of the most famous ones were Andrew Carnegie, who had a corporation called U.S. Steel, which really controlled most of the steel production in the United States. J.D. Rockefeller, who created Standard Oil, which at the time was really the monopoly in terms of the oil production, gasoline production. And then Leland Stanford, and that name should be a little familiar because Stanford University is named after him in California. And he was the monopoly he controlled was the Central Pacific Railroad. So these were the first true American millionaires, and back then $1 million was actually a lot of money, and they were incredibly powerful in the late 1800s. With this new construction of an economy, it relied a lot on labor, on people building things. People had to be in the factories to make stuff for all these people that we just talked about to make lots of money. And they found, these people that were building things, found that they were not treated very well. They worked long hours, they did not have much rights, and they were paid very poorly. So they began to organize, and organize into something called a union. And the union would be a collection of the workers in either a particular plant or multiple plants that all had the same goals. And so the power of lots of people could be put towards the company to try to get better wages and benefits. With that came strikes and unrest. If the labor union did not get what it wanted, oftentimes it would send its workers out on strike, meaning they would no longer work. And there were some famous strikes in the 1800s. The railroad strike of 1877, and then the Haymarket riots of 1886, also the Pullman strike of 1893. These were all huge strikes that then led to labor unrest, and so battles in the streets between workers and police and the management. And one of the most important unions, which really was powerful even to today, was called the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And this is an organization that controlled lots and lots of workers and had a lot of pull to try to get them better benefits. At the same time that Americans were moving from the farms to the factories, lots of people were moving from outside of the United States to America. And that was because the U.S. had all these jobs. And so it became a land of plenty for people around the world. If you lived in a very sad condition in Europe, you look to America as a real shining beacon, as an opportunity for you to and your family to do better. And so people moved from predominantly Eastern Europe and also from China to the United States. We had European immigration moving into Ellis Island in New York, passing by the Statue of Liberty, which really was that call for freedom and opportunity. And Asian immigration moved to Angel Island in San Francisco and predominantly helped with the developing of the West Coast. As this happened, you had neighborhoods, whole neighborhoods in big cities like New York or San Francisco that were predominantly one ethnic group. So when you think of Chinatown in San Francisco, or you think of Little Italy in New York, these were built by the people that came over from those countries and all wanted to live together. Unfortunately, when you have a new group of people come in, oftentimes you get some prejudices that are built. And so there was something called nativism that started to develop with Americans, where there were some anti-immigration thoughts and ideas. They wanted to try to keep people out, keep jobs for Americans, and oftentimes there was a lot of prejudice associated with that, including some acts which excluded people from coming in from other countries. And the most important of these was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which denied Chinese citizens the opportunity to come to America because of some of these prejudice. So this is a little bit of information about kind of the major shift after the Civil War related to our economy. We'll talk a little bit about how this affects social issues later for the first unit of the second semester. But for now, good luck on this, and let me know if I can help.